The radio warning lasted so long that it stopped sounding like a warning and started sounding like a countdown. For 6 hours, an American destroyer told the Iranian flagged cargo ship Tuska to change course, clear the engine room, and comply. For 6 hours, nothing changed. Then the destroyer put a round into the engine room, killed the propulsion, and Marines came down from helicopters onto the ship in the dark. That is the scene. Steel deck, night wind, ropes, rotors. A Daron will be reduced from an instrument of defiance to a floating target. Most people will watch that and conclude that the story is simple. Iran crossed a line. America answered, end of story. The real story is that the United States just showed it is trying to change the nature of the Hormuz conflict itself, not just pressure Iran. Redefine the battle space for weeks. The fight around Hormuz was still living inside a narrow logic. Iran made the straight, dangerous markets panic. Washington tried to impose a blockade. Tankers hesitated. Oil moved in pulses. Every side tested limits. The corridor remained a zone of leverage, ambiguity, and selective risk. The boarding of the Tuska points towards something harsher. A corridor can be a bargaining chip, or it can become a machine. And Washington is now trying to turn Hormuz into a machine. Detect, classify, track, warn, disable, board, seize. That is the real escalation. Not because one ship was stopped, because a method was demonstrated. Once a method is demonstrated publicly, once the region sees that the blockade can physically immobilize a ship and place Marines on it, every actor around the waterway starts recalculating. Tanker captains recalculate, insurers recalculate, trading desks recalculate, Tehran recalculates, Beijing recalculates. So do the Gulf states, who now have to think not only about Iranian harassment, but about how far the American seizure campaign could expand. This matters because Tehran's strategy in Hormuz was always built on a very different use of time. Iran did not need to close the strait perfectly. It only needed to make it dangerous enough that the price of oil, insurance, and uncertainty did its work for it. That is the genius and the weakness of choke point strategy. You do not need military dominance. You need transmitted anxiety. If a tanker captain hesitates, if a ship reroutes, if oil spikes, if politicians start getting blamed for fuel costs, then a weaker power has already started moving pressure through a stronger power system. Iran understood that. That is why Hormuz mattered more than any single military unit it still had left. But there is a hidden condition in that strategy. The fear has to stay politically complicated. The moment the fear becomes too visible, too indiscriminate, too ugly, the stronger side gets a cleaner story to tell, and clean stories are operational assets. That is what Iran may have missed. Once the IRGC reopened fire on shipping and the region started seeing vessels turn, panic, and take damage. Washington gained something it did not fully have before. A simpler argument for a more muscular phase, not we are pressuring Iran, not we are running a blockade as leverage, but we are stopping ships that are part of a dangerous corridor under active threat. That distinction sounds semantic until you see what it does in practice. It widens what can be justified. A blockade can still look like coercion. A live boarding after warning fire can be presented as enforcement. And enforcement is easier to scale. That is why the American force package matters. Destroyers are not there only to be symbols. Boarding teams are not there only to intimidate. Carrier aircraft are not there only for headline value. Sensors, patrol aircraft, drones, helicopters, Marines, special operations capacity. All of it starts to make sense when you understand the new objective. The objective is not merely to wait at a line. It is to turn movement itself into vulnerability. That is a very different game. The old Hormuz problem was geography, a narrow waterway, mines, missile batteries, swarms, harassing fire, deniable disruption. The new American answer is systems. Track the vessel, map the route, read the signature, watch the AI's behavior, classify ownership, build legal and operational grounds, isolate it in wider water, disable propulsion, board it in simple terms. Iran tried to make the corridor too dangerous to use normally. America is trying to make the corridor too transparent to manipulate cheaply. That does not mean Washington has solved the problem, far from it. Hormuz is still narrow. Iranian asymmetric tools still matter, mines still matter, drones still matter, fast boats still matter, coastal missiles still matter. Miscalculation matters most of all. But the key shift is this. The burden of risk is being redistributed. Instead of tanker traffic carrying almost all the uncertainty, Iran now has to carry more of it itself. Every Iranian-linked vessel that moves can become a tracking problem, a boarding problem, a seizure problem, a legal problem, a propaganda problem. That is how leverage starts to rot from the inside. And that is why this may be one of the most dangerous moments in the whole crisis. Because if you look at Tehran's options, honestly, none of them are clean. Iran can continue using Hormuz as a visible threat. But then every new incident gives Washington a stronger case to expand interdiction and a stronger argument to say the strait is not merely contested but actively abused. Iran can pull back and reduce visible risk, but then it looks as if the first hard American boarding operation forced a retreat, which is exactly the image hardliners inside the regime do not want to project. Iran can shift to more deniable or more indirect forms of pressure, but that only works if deniability remains credible. And once the Americans start widening surveillance and interdiction beyond the narrowest point of the strait, the room for low-cost deniability narrows with it. Iran can try to buy time in talks, but that requires some coherence in Tehran's own decision making, and the regime has not looked coherent. Diplomats hint one way, security actors lean another, and every contradiction becomes a tax on negotiation. That internal split is not background noise. It is the center of the problem. There is the Iran that still sees a deal, however ugly, as a means of survival. And there is the Iran that sees any concession extracted under pressure as proof that only greater resistance is safe. The United States is negotiating with the first Iran while being strategically challenged by the second. That is why this crisis keeps generating contradictory signals. One voice opens a door, another voice fires near it, and because no one on the outside can be fully certain which voice can bind the state, every round of diplomacy inherits instability before it even begins. Then there is the outer ring around all of this. China matters not because it is visibly fighting in Hormuz, but because it spent years helping create the conditions in which Iran could survive pressure longer than Washington expected. Dark fleet shipping payment outside the dollar system, Chinese buying capacity, a quiet commercial ecosystem that makes sanctions hurt without always making them decisive. That external architecture changes everything about time. If Iran can keep money moving, if oil can still find buyers, if economic strangulation never becomes complete, then Tehran does not negotiate from immediate collapse. It negotiates from damage. Damage is painful, collapse is final. China helps preserve the difference, but preserving the difference between damage and collapse does not mean Iran automatically uses its leverage wisely. In fact, it can create a second problem. A state that knows it can survive longer sometimes starts believing it can escalate more intelligently than it actually can. That is the danger support. Can create endurance. Endurance can create overconfidence. And overconfidence at a choke point is how you accidentally upgrade your enemy's mandate. That is what may have happened here. The boarding of the Tuska did not prove that the United States has solved Hormuz. It proved that the United States found a way to make Iranian escalation produce American operational room. That is a serious strategic change. And it reaches beyond one night. If seizures expand, then the campaign stops being a simple line drawn at the mouth of the Gulf. It becomes an architecture of pressure spreading outward into the Gulf of Oman, the Arabian Sea, and the longer routes that keep Iranian trade and proxy logistics alive. The more that happens, the less Hormuz looks like a pure choke point contest, and the more it looks like a rolling interdiction regime that is precisely the kind of development Tehran should have wanted to avoid. Because a choke point favors the actor who can weaponize geography. A rolling interdiction regime favors the actor with more sensors, more legal reach, more aviation, more decks, and more patience for repetitive enforcement. Washington wants this to become repetitive. That is the key. A one-off boarding is drama. A repeated boarding pattern is a new order. And once repetition arrives, psychology changes. Markets stop pricing a temporary shock and start pricing a new structure. Governments stop waiting for a flare up to pass and start planning around a sustained enforcement reality. Regional actors begin making side calculations about how to live inside that reality or how to bargain around it. That is why the diplomatic venue matters too. Islamabad is no longer occurring in the shadow of abstract threats. It is occurring after a physical demonstration that the Americans are ready to disable and seize not just worn in posture that changes the negotiation atmosphere, even if no formal American position changes at all. Because power is not only what you say you can do, power is what the other side has now seen you do. So no, the deepest story here is not that the United States boarded one Iranian flagged ship. The deepest story is that Tehran may have made the exact kind of move that allows a stronger adversary to shift from contested blockade to scalable enforcement. In other words, Iran may have tried to raise the cost of the crisis and instead helped redesign it. That is a much worse outcome than a tactical loss. A tactical loss can be avenged. A redesigned crisis has to be survived, and survival gets harder when every move you make gives the other side a cleaner pretext, a wider map, and more permission than it had the day before. The image everyone will remember is the helicopter ropes in the dark. The sentence they should remember is simpler. Iran did not just provoke a response. It may have opened the door to a system.